He won't. You just don't. And we, so you'll find people just want to be called Indian, Native American, Indigenous, First Nations Canada. Anybody want to guess what the number one thing Native people want to be called? Tony? No? They want to be called by their tribal identity. So that's the first thing. I am Swinomish. I am Skagit. I am actually Yakima, Snoqualmie, Skagit, Swinomish. I might have missed something in there. There's quite a few. But we don't, even though the government enrolls us as one, we don't identify with the one the government's enrolled us. So my grandmother had one sister. My grandmother was enrolled full-blooded Skagit, and the government enrolled her full-blooded sister as full-blooded Yakima. They just kind of picked one and put them on each side of the family, and that's the way it was. But we never recognized that, just the one thing. So the stories that I'm talking about, I get this a lot. That was a long time ago, kind of like, aren't you over it? Well, it wasn't a long time ago. This is my family, my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my tribal community. I watched them come home in the 70s when I started working with the tribe, when they'd only been recognized for 2 years. And I got to watch our families start to come home. So it wasn't a long time ago. And when I share this with you, I don't want anybody to feel like they should feel blame or guilt. That's not the point. You're not responsible for the journeys that we've gone through, but I do say you're responsible for knowing more and knowing accurate history, right? So I don't ever want you to feel like, God, I feel really bad, like, I should be, going out and doing some sort of self-punishment. I don't want you to feel guilty, and I don't want you to feel blame. So I'm going to start by talking about the boarding schools. In our family, we had 3 generations. My great-grandmother, who started at ʷalʔalq, and Sheriff, you can go over one, ʷalʔalq boarding school, and my grandmother also, and her sister went to ʷalʔalq boarding school. At the boarding school, the first thing they did was cut their hair and put them in uniforms and give them a schedule, and they learned how to be domestics, especially if you're a woman, you learn how to be domestic. And when, Laura's one of them, when people have talked to our elders about the language, because they were first speakers, they wouldn't speak the language. They could viscerally feel the punishment that came when they tried to speak the language. And then I've had other elders tell me stories where they snuck down in the basement so they could speak the language. The children took care of each other, especially when they were sick. They had to sleep with the windows open because of pneumonia and tuberculosis. They were away from their family, they were away from their traditional foods, they were away from their teachings, and they were heartbroken and lonely. It was not a good place for them to be. And it wasn't a choice that they had. The government man, that's the words that they've told me, could come and get you when you were about 5 or 6 years old. Anybody here, mother, father, grandparents, aunties, uncles? Do we have any of them in there? Yeah, everybody. Imagine if somebody came to take your children and you couldn't do anything. As a grandmother, I would lay down a life for my grandchildren. I would lay down my very life for them. And imagine how unempowered they felt when they couldn't do anything. So after the ʷalʔalq boarding school, they went to Chemawa. My grandmother went to Chemawa, and my mother went to Chemawa as well. And at Chemawa, when you went there, the first thing they did was cut your hair, put DDT on it, because if you're Indian, of course, you must have head lice, give you a uniform. I've seen their daily schedule that they gave them, so their lives were scheduled from morning to night. And they had matrons to take care of them on each floor. And they were not allowed to speak their language. They were not able to celebrate their culture. The whole purpose of this was to take their identity. The whole purpose was cultural genocide. And when you take away your culture and you take away your identity, at the same time, what they're saying is that your parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles, all that you've taught them is not good. And there's a confusion about who you go home to and who you are, because you're getting this year round. And there's lots of stories of kids in boarding school where they didn't come home for years. They were away from their family for years. These are my generations that went to boarding school. My mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. Imagine what you learned by learning to parent in an institution. So for the oldest ones, they would still remember what their mother and father taught them, what they're like. But as you go down generations, you learn your parenting and skills institutionally. You learn about schedules, you learn about routine, but you don't learn parenting. And that is probably the greatest thing that was lost in that. So a lot of people I know are incredible grandparents because they had relationships with their grandparents, and then there's this void because they were taught to be parents in an institution. Did you go again? This is just another picture of the boarding schools. This picture of this little girl here, I don't know if you can see, but it's a picture of a little girl looking out of a window at ʷalʔalq. And I wonder what the children thought when they went so far away and how alone they were. What did that feel like to them? And I thought this little girl looked like that. The picture on the lower right is my mom. She graduated from ʷalʔalq, salutatorian, and so she was wickedly smart and didn't belong anywhere. So that journey I'll talk about in a little bit. I'm going to tell you one quick story about children going to boarding school. I met a woman from Anacortes a few months ago, and she was a flight attendant on Alaska Air back in the 70s. And she was up at Anchorage, and the plane filled up with all these Alaska Native children. It was just full of these children. And she said they were crying, and some were vomiting. And she said that she had no idea why these children were on this plane. I said, "You were going to Oregon, weren't you?" And she said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "You were going to Salem, Oregon, weren't you?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "You were taking those children to ʷalʔalq." And she got to experience what that looked like in real time. So this is my last story about boarding school, and this is Annabelle. She is still alive. I ran into her last week. She's 95 years old, and she is a spitfire. I love this woman. So when I came back and started working for the tribe at 20, I would always ask my elders, "Did you go to boarding school?" Because my mom didn't talk about it very much originally. She did not talk about it, as a lot didn't. And so I would ask elders and find out, because I wanted to understand her experience. And I said, "Annabelle, did you go to boarding school?" And she stood up, all 4'8" of her, and said, "No, I didn't go to boarding school. I was the youngest of 14 children. And when the government man," her words, "came to take me, the older children stood in front of me and said, 'No, not this one.' Her older siblings were not going to allow the government man to take her. Her father was a respected minister and had a lumber business upriver, so he's a respected part of the community. And at the same time, the kids were standing in front of him saying, 'You're not taking this one.' He was pleading and begging to the government, 'Can I raise just this one child? Can I raise just this one?' When she told me the story, I cried for 3 days. The idea that an honorable man would have to beg to raise his child, and how deeply he desired to have that experience of not having the child go away, and how they come back in a place of brokenness. She's pretty amazing. She's a handful, isn't she? Yes. She wants to live till 100. Now, I say that because a few years ago, she was running out to get the paper before Wheel of Fortune. So you can imagine, you gotta have your Wheel of Fortune when you're 90 years old. She runs out to get the paper across the street, gets hit by a car, goes flying in the air, goes in a ditch. She ends up in the hospital and then in a nursing home, which you think she'd never come out of. She was out and back home within a year. That is Skagit strong. So I'm going to talk a little bit what happened after the boarding schools. Is anybody familiar with the Indian Child Welfare Act? Probably not. A little bit, yeah. So it's really difficult if the government actually gets in and make us a federal law, like our right to freedom of religion. The country's built on freedom of religion, but we had to have a federal law. We have a federal law called the Indian Child Welfare Act because so many of our children were being taken from the homes and adopted in non-native homes. And when they were adopted in non-native homes, they would lose what tribe they're from, their culture. They would lose everything. They would lose who they were. And so many of our children never found that again. It was lost forever. So they made the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the purpose is to protect our children. So children have to go first. I consider this good social work, but first to somebody in your family, your brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, somebody close in your family. Second, your tribe. Third, other Indians. And last, non-native people. And if a child is placed, I was on the advisory committee for DSHS, if a child was placed in a non-native home, that child's case had to be reviewed every single month. Because if you're not sure whether children will question why they're different, as they grow up, they will. Even in the best and most loving home, they go through this time of, like all teenagers, trying to identify who they are. How am I doing for time? Am I good? Okay. When I talk a lot about the boarding schools because it's my family's experience and what was lost and the pain of that in the generations. You can imagine what was taken from that because you don't learn how to be family, you don't learn how to be mom, you don't learn traditions. Jay and I, growing up, we didn't understand how come my mom didn't do a lot of these things. And it's like, well, how could she teach us what she doesn't know? Why would traditional holidays that you celebrate, why would she give any importance to that? Because everything she did, she'd have to mimic from dominant society anyway, right? So it wasn't part of her family tradition. How would she know about Halloween or Easter or all these traditions that people have when they didn't do it in the boarding school? And it wasn't part of her family tradition. So when I'm talking about that, you can imagine the cost to families from being broken up and to be what the men felt like as protectors and guardians, the grandfathers, the uncles, the mothers, the grandmothers and grandfathers who were the teachers. There was a void that was undescribable in the community. But when I was talking about this, I have a family member said, Kay, you need to talk about the lost children. You need to talk about us. They're as important as the children in boarding schools. So this is ʷalʔalq's story. Anybody know ʷalʔalq? Probably heard him play. He's a violinist, a storyteller, a great humorist. He is also a child who was adopted by a non-native home. And in that non-native home, he was not exposed to any of his native family, and somehow they got him playing violin, and he was very good at it. And so he was in the basement most of the time unless they would call him up to play violin and kind of show him off. And he left that situation traumatized about who he was, the value of who he was as an Indian child, and his future. It's taken him probably most of his adult life to continue this journey of who I am as a Native man. And that had such a profound effect on him. This is ʷalʔalq. I talked to him and said, he wrote a piece called Amazing Grace. And when he started, he was a street performer when he got out of the Army. He was a drill sergeant and worked for the chaplain. I said, well, ʷalʔalq, how did that work? He said, oh, I just march them all over to the chaplains, right? He'd march his recruits all over to the chaplain. It was a good match for him, but then he got out of the Army and he was lost. He needed to find his way, and he was a street musician. And he had a lot of conflict and a lot of anger and a lot of confusion. And he met this man who helped change his life, an experience that started out really poorly. You can go on YouTube and watch it, Amazing Grace story. It's amazing. And I said, would you play Amazing Grace for me? But these are the words that he thought about when he thinks of Amazing Grace. So we're going to try to share that.
That I know who I am is evidence of my education. That I know who I am is evidence of my education. How I know who I am is my culture. The application or acquisition of knowledge is the measure of my intelligence. The systemic denial of my identity, culture, and inherent intelligence is genocidal. Honor is the antidote to genocide. From my culture, I've learned to recognize and acknowledge the journey of all that honor us with their presence. From my honor, I can recognize their truth, feelings, significance, and the passions they act on by their own volition, including, but not limited to, the recognition and acknowledgement of my honor. From that grace, honor becomes an equalizer on the scales of justice, and the pipeline divine love flows through. This is the transformational power of amazing grace.
That is a man with the most gracious heart and growing, and continues to challenge himself to grow all the time. And one of the things that I love most in our community is there are a lot of people that have had incredible pain. You may not ever know that, because what comes out is loving and giving and supporting and grace. And so he's going to continue sharing his words with you. I would encourage you to look him up on YouTube and listen to some of his music and his stories. He's continued to be out there, and I think that he has grown through so much. So those stories are really tough, and those are just the very lightest touches on those stories. They're much more complicated and much more difficult than what I've shared. When I asked my granddaughter today, I told her I was leaving to speak to you all, and she said, "Nana, can you just stay home?" I said, "Well, I have to speak." She said, "Well, can I speak for you?" So I'm going to share with you the words that she sent to you. I said, "What would you tell about our ancestors, my mother and my grandmother and the family?" She said, "I would tell you that they were very wonderful. And what else would you say? They were treated very poorly." That was going to be my whole speech, the end, the words and wisdom of an 8-year-old. But it's so fitting in this time that's so difficult, that the one thing I said about my mom is that she fell on her knees a lot of times, my auntie, my ancestors, but they stood up. And they stood up because they loved their family, they loved their community, and that need was greater than the pain they were in that moment. So each one has tried to heal and be stronger for the generation below them. And I believe that the way we heal is we have teachers that teach the language and the stories and the weaving. We have artists like my brother Jay. We have all sorts of people that we go to help put us back together again, all those pieces back together again. So today, Native people have an incredible struggle that they have historical trauma, but we are artists and teachers and business people, doctors and lawyers and nurses, educators. We are so many things, but we carry those teachings and those challenges that our ancestors were before us, and we don't forget that. We don't forget what they did, and that we have a responsibility to try to heal, both for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, but for them as well. So I'm not a very fluent speaker. Lora, as one of my teachers, she's very patient with me. But every time I pray in the language or speak in the language, I honor what was taken from them. The language, the stories, the traditions, the teachings of weaving, all of that was taken from them. So every time I participate in that, I watch that, Lora gives her heart to that. It is healing both to our ancestors and to our children and grandchildren. The cost of all this, for us, in fact, we lost another tribal member this week to a drug overdose. That's our number one loss: alcohol addiction, suicide rates, domestic violence. There's a price to be paid. And we work each and every day to understand that when we see somebody, there's a story behind there. It's not just this person who's having a broken moment. There's a whole familial story. And that person is probably a really amazing person standing in front of you. And to look past what is coming out as historical trauma into the beautiful place that this person is underneath all of that. So we are resilient, strong, spiritual, educated. We're doctors, lawyers, nurses, and trade people. We are all sorts of things, but we are resilient. And I think the thing that gets us through each day is the teachings of our ancestors and looking to them for that guidance. that's what I have done this last week, wondering what would they say to me, right? What would they say? And they would say they stand up. And the way we do this is we stand together. We are not just tribal community, we are community. And we need each other to stand with each other, to know each other better. There's a lot of amazing stories out there. I've got to hear a few of them from some of the people at Burlington Lutheran. Each have your own amazing story. And we need to stand together to do this and to never, ever let somebody feel alone. They are not alone. We share this journey. So I'm going to turn this over to my cousin and let her speak. I thank you for letting me share some of our story. And I'd also encourage you, we went last Sunday to watch Missing from Fire Trail Road. The Children of the Setting Sun did this film. You can rent it on a bunch of different platforms I saw today. It is similar and a really deep story about a missing woman who went missing in 2020 and about missing and murdered Indigenous women. But they also talk about the boarding schools and lost children from Indian child welfare. And it is worth seeing. It's really difficult, so make sure you're in a really strong space to watch it. But it's really informative. So if you're able to watch it, I would encourage you to do that. Are you ready, beautiful?
skʷalʔalq ʷalʔalq. I want to thank my beloved elder, ʷalʔalq, for laying this path before me. And much thanks to my cousins who are also here. We don't do this alone. That's one of the things that as I was sitting there listening to my cousin, my grandmother, Eva Jo, was also at boarding schools, and she was there with my grandma Vi Hilbert, and they relied on each other. There wasn't a time that I never got to meet my grandmother. She died when my mom was 9. But when I finally got to meet my grandma Vi, she would tell me about the boarding school experiences. And Grandma Vi said, oh, they weren't that bad at all. It was a good place to get education. And then she would also say that my grandmother taught her how to fight. Grandma Vi was younger and sweet, and my grandma Eva would say, Ginny, you gotta put your hand in the air, and you gotta fight them. And Grandma Vi said she'd stand there and she would just cry. And then all of the cousins would come around and protect her. And so as I listened to my beloved ʷalʔalq, I thought about what it takes in each one of us to have this ability to stand and fight, or to stand and cry. In our traditions, we have always been here. This is our land. This is where our Skagit people have come from. But when the colonists came, things changed. And I don't know if people quite understand how we got from sovereign people who've been here from time immemorial into this place where our very lives can be taken, our children, our generations, our futures. And we don't understand our own history as a country where we can, because we are the government of this country, and how we can, as a government, say, not only can we take this land, not only can we take these homes, but we can take their very children. How did that come about? When we read these things about our Constitution and how there are all these freedoms, and then you look at our tribal experiences, and they're not there. There was not any sort of freedom. How does that come about? Because people have to sleep at night. They have to be able to look forward to plan as government. But how do you look at this section of population and say, they're not human enough to raise their own children. And that's literally some of the discussions that happened on the congressional floor. How do we deal with this Indian problem? They don't want to stop. Well, how do we deal with this Indian problem? Because they never defined what the Indian problem was. We never chose to not be ourselves. No matter how many opportunities they gave us to stop being tribal, we never chose that. Why would we? Atsistabi, Chad. It's me. I'm a Native American. I'm a Skagit. I'm Nookachobs. I'm Eva Jo's granddaughter. Why would I ever give that up? Well, to look at how our country warped itself to do that is a fascinating process. It's terrifyingly fascinating. And it started even before the United States existed. Way back, well, it's going to start first before the country existed, and then, yes, we're going to go back to the Ice Age, but stay with me, okay? So first off, let's look at how the United States came into being. Britain came here. We were all colonists. Some of us came over as, not as colonists, but we were actual criminals. This was the first country where England exported its criminals. More criminals were exported to what became the United States than were sent to Australia. But we don't ever talk about the fact that a ton of our founding fathers were the descendants of criminals exported out of England. But they had ideas of what we were, and they never changed from that. The ideas that came from colonialism is that we are not human. We don't have souls. We don't have government. We don't have monumental architecture. We don't have. And yet, what we do have, my cousin has told you about. But to look at how the United States was even formed is fascinating. One of the main things about the American Revolution that we never talk about is Mad King George stopped westward expansion. And we don't ever hear about that, do we? England comes here, gets the colonists, says, yep, we're going to take over this entire country. And then Mad King George puts a proclamation out that says, no, we need to stop westward expansion. Well, one, we don't know that he did that, but two, we don't know why. What happened is way back before the United States even existed, the Cherokees understood what needed to happen. And so many of the Cherokee elders said, we need to understand these people that are going to live with us. We have allowed them to live next to us, and we need to understand them. And so these Cherokee elders sent their children to British schools. Before the United States even exists, the Cherokees were taking and understanding the British system. Those lawyers, those children that grew up to be lawyers for the Cherokee, went into the British courts and won. All of those treaties that the British had signed with the native populations, they were violating. And so these young lawyers, freshly minted out of the British schools, came into the British courts and caused havoc. And Mad King George, even with as crazy as he was, realized we don't know what to do. We understand these aren't people and that God has given us this country and that we as the colonizers, we have rights to everything. And yet these upstart lawyers came into our courts and won. What happens? How do you change your mindset that quickly? Well, they didn't. What happened is when the colonists from here said, you want to stop me expanding west? They said, oh, absolutely not. And along with the other reasons that we know about, that's how we get to the Revolutionary War. We don't talk about the natives in the Revolutionary War at all, do we? And yet it's a huge, profound influence on why this country exists. It's also a profound influence on why Native people are not considered part of our regular political system or regular founding of this country or regular, nothing that happens to us in the courts is the same as it is for you. And it stems from this beginning where Native people are not humans in the first place. So as you go west, all of these treaties that were signed in bad faith and then tossed out, it's because when you make an agreement, if you don't think that's a person that you're agreeing with in the first place, why do you have to follow that treaty at all? And so as this tide of this march west happened, by the time they got out to us here on the west coast, to this valley, they already knew what to do. They took and examined what they needed. They decided that we as Skagit people had chiefs, which we didn't. There's no such thing as hereditary chiefs, there's no word for that in our language. They decided that we all had a central council, and that central council controlled everything. Absolutely not. Here in the Skagit Valley, we were individual villages, and basically it was a family-run village. And like any family, you have your people who are good at politics, you have people who are good at war, you have people who are good at fishing. And that's how this came. There was no central council where we sat together and decided like you see in the movies. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we didn't have to have that. This was such a lush area to live that our governments and our agreements between each other were based on tradition and kinship. If I, as a Nookachops person, wanted to come down here to fish, I would come down to my relatives down here, and this long-standing agreement between our families is how I would come down to fish. There was no border line between me and my cousins down here. Even that structure that's been put on us about how different villages were actually fighting over land, no, that's nothing to do with our culture. Even our treaties have nothing to do with Skagit culture. Our treaties were written on as a template. And every single tribe, think about this, the treaties are basically the same from Florida to Washington, from Maine to California. The basic premises of each one of these treaties is dehumanizing. It basically sets from their mindset of what it took to be their form of Indian, and then wiped out all of our individuality. And think about that. When you look at your family history, where you come from, what you value, what you think, can you imagine all of you now being just one standard template? You see how the structure from the beginning of this country was set up to wipe us out. Even the way, and this is one of those fascinating things, I'm gonna take a left on you guys, it's really fun, okay? By the time you get here, we're some of the last treaties that were written. So there was a system, how you round everybody up, how you divide the land away from them, and so although we had heard about these things before, we did not have a tour de force like the American government by the time they got here, okay? Well, we've been on this land since time immemorial. I know this. My cousins know this. We've always been here. And why do we know that? Well, Grandma Vi told me that. Who told Grandma Vi? Aunt Susie. And if there's anybody more formidable in my life than Grandma Vi Hilbert, it's Aunt Susie Sampson Peters. And I would like to challenge anybody to take on those women and tell them we have not been here forever, because I'm gonna sit there with some popcorn and watch these women take them out, because that is one of the hallmarks of our culture. The women The women are the strength of our communities. There's many movers and shakers in any direction, but if you want things done, you go to the women. So we get here, the U.S. government gets here and has decided how this is going to, what it's going to look like. And so the land is divided. The kids are, one of the most interesting things about getting here, once those treaties were signed, right? You think that once the treaty is signed, everything's going to happen. No. It took 4 years for a ratification. So the treaty was signed. All of us were taken and put on these very small portions of land with inadequate food, inadequate, think about it, just everybody shoved into one place. There was no hygiene, barely any housing. You literally have the government agents writing back to the feds. These people are starving, something needs to be done. But we were not allowed to go off those reservations, even though the treaty hadn't been signed or hadn't been ratified. So for 4 years, no provisions were brought into us at all. And yet we were not allowed to go off. And people literally said, forget it. I'm going to feed my children. And went off into the mountains and went off. And some stayed, okay? And so we are the descendants of boarding school survivors, but we're also descendants of these people who have been here for generations who decided, I'm feeding my children, okay? One of the interesting things that's happening to us now is, you see all of that depersonalization that happened there, but it also happens as in the sciences. And it's a fascinating thing. We aren't a part of any medical study, so you don't know what aspirin does to you, but you've heard about it in these studies. We're not part of those studies. There's not enough Native people that you can say, what does this do to this population? And yet we've only been eating this diet for a few short 100 years. So how do you know what high blood pressure does when I don't even have the same history biologically as other folks? But even in the sciences, they still try to wipe us out. My favorite one of trying to eradicate us from history is they try to tell us that we have not been here on this land for very long. It's almost like when they can look at the Bering Strait land bridge. Have you guys heard that? This is supposed to be during the ice ages. The water comes up into the glaciers. And so then once it pulls up enough, then where there are ways that you could walk from Asia to here. Well, I don't know very many people who would walk that far. But what they're saying actually is it would be more likely for human beings to walk rather than float on a log with a paddle. And that it's more likely for us to wait until all of the water recedes and we can walk than we would have taken a water route. And so this entire fascinating thing, and it's even still, there's still some debate about this. There is one of the oldest civilizations that have been studied here is this Clovis culture. Clovis are really cool, okay? Everybody is quite aware that, every human culture has always studied, or has always made stone tools, every single one of us. We've just done it more recently, okay? But everybody can think of arrowheads, right? Well, in Clovis culture, they have, instead of arrowheads, they have these cool things, and they're points. And they're this beautiful leaf-shaped point. And people thought, what's the difference between an arrowhead and a point? Well, because an arrowhead, as you can hear by the title, is for arrows. But for a point, you can make it into a knife, you can make it into a spear, you can make it into any of the throwing devices, okay? So a point, and their Clovis points are beautiful. And that is a gorgeous culture that's about 17,000 years old. And they're saying, this works perfectly. The glaciers pull back the water, we get the Bering Strait land bridge, everybody can walk across, and then come down here and make Clovis culture. And isn't that nice? Land bridge about 20,000 years ago, Clovis culture about 17,000 years ago. But it means that folks came over the Bering Strait land bridge 17,000 years ago, and yet there are archaeological sites all the way down to the Americas. If this process of taking away even our ancestral identity is true, then we came across that land bridge at a dead sprint, and we should be winning every single contest for running. Because how do you get from the Bering Strait land bridge all the way down to South America in 20,000 years? We're athletes. I'm going to be in the Olympics. I'm 60 years old. I'm going to win. Okay? When you take away in the sciences, they use the sciences to even take away our existence on this continent 20,000 years ago. Why is that important? How does that relate to the treaties? Well, if they can say that we weren't really here very long, because how long have we been in Europe as humans? 40,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. Well, no. If you look at when what England was happening in England 40,000 years ago, they were under ice. They were not over there writing Shakespeare 40,000 years ago. They are human beings just like us, living in a very amazing place and a very critical time in history as human beings. And yet that is acknowledged as existence. And that is acknowledged as they've always been in Europe, always. But over here, even if it was Bering Strait land bridge, which it's not, but even if it was, our 20,000 years doesn't matter, because we even use the science of archaeology to say it's okay to steal land from Native American people because they haven't been here that long. It is a terrifying concept of how humans dehumanize other humans. We do it through legal processes, through treaties. We do it through winning legal processes, like the Cherokee lawyers do. We do it through the science, the amazing science of archaeology. We're still rationalizing how we can harm other people with any means necessary. And I will tell you, I love archaeology. I've been in and done test pits. I have literally seen basket fragments come out of a wet site, because basket fragments don't survive. And yet, right over here in Skagit Valley, right over by Conway, I got to see a basket fragment come out as they were taking a dike apart. And to think, here these waterways were obstructed to make farmland, and yet it saves impressive parts of our culture. And that basket fragment, I got to be part of the group that drove it up to Canada, because one of the best places to restore this basket, to preserve it, was up on a Canadian reserve, and these tribal folks. And it was an amazing time to see all of the work they're doing to preserve our cultural heritage by stabilizing this basket fragment. So to see it come out of the ground, because you better believe when the archaeologists pulled it out, all of us dropped everything and went flying up to the farmland there in Skagit Valley, and we're like, this is so cool. Because I can look at that basement fragment, and I love this, even though it only dated to, like, I think it was like 2,000 years old, even though it only dated 2,000 years, I love that concept. My ancestors made our ancestors, wove that basket fragment. It got stuck in what the colonists were doing to our farmland and ruining our waterways. And then it was taken out of the ground. And I hope that my weaving students will be some of the students that will take that basket fragment and resurrect that basket, because that's what they're doing now. They're taking what was done to us by taking all of our, from our children to our heritage, to our culture, to our language. And instead, we're going to be like the Cherokee. And we're going to send our kids to college, and we're going to learn these systems, and then we're also going to help them learn all of our traditional knowledge so that we can go back and look at those basket fragments and say, oh, that's how they did this, and recreate those baskets because that is the heritage that we have been passed down, the resilience that you can deny our very existence in any way you want. And we're still going to say, Atsi stabu chud, Atsi stabu chud, with my family. And our candle is going out here, so it's covering me with smoke. So I think that when we started talking about this, how do you look at science and politics and realize how much trauma that is inherent in all of our systems, and what we have to do as tribal people in order to continue being ourselves? Well, it is the same thing that my Grandma Vi said to me. Remember who you are. Remember who you come from. Remember where you want your grandchildren to be. I know that my grandchildren's grandchildren will stand here and be able to say, Atsistabu Chad. And for that, I am eternally grateful to the traditions my ancestors passed down to me, because I know that they are here with us today. Sometimes they're helping us like this, and sometimes they're helping us like this. But I know that we will always be able to work together and to take apart these things that don't work, these lies that have been taught to us, and pull them to pieces, because that's what they are. And then we can take this pain and trauma that we have been, where they try to wipe us out, try to pretend we've never been here. They try to take everything from us. And even from that, we simply love our people. We love each other. And there is nothing that we can't do. There's nothing that we can't heal from. Because I don't look at us as anything other than whole hearts. My beloved elders, I know, will always have nothing but kindness and goodness. And that's what we'll do. We will help heal these things, these lies, and that we'll learn to be whole people together, because that's the only thing that's going to bring us out of this, is if we can undo these things that are in our minds. And we're adults now, all adults. We can handle all the things that have happened to us. It's not about guilt or shame. It's like, that's what they thought. We recognize this as a process of genocide. And we can say we can do different. We have to accept that and say, no, I'm not that. My ancestors were mistaken, misled. And we can be adults and handle all of this with love and caring. So I want to thank you for listening today. Okay. My beloved has asked me to tell you a story called Lifting the Sky. Al tudi tuhak, a long time ago, all of the animals thought they were people. Bears thought they were people. Deer thought they were people. Even those silly human beings, they thought they were people. At the time of creation, many things were left to evolve. And later on, it's the time that we're talking about. The villages had come, the people were talking. But one of the things that the Creator had done as they were creating this world is the sky was very low. And for some of us, this was no problem. But for others, they had to walk like this because the sky was that far down. And the Creator had left this for us to handle. And so the other thing the Creator had done in the time before this, at the time of creation, the Creator had made all of these beautiful languages and had traveled in the direction of the sun and said, all these languages, everybody's going to be able to express themselves. They're going to be able to sing. They'll be able to. And so the Creator had gone in the direction of the sun and given all of these languages to this entire world, to all of creation. And everybody loved their languages, except when it came down to problem solving as a group. Here we had this sky that was, I think, at a very appropriate level. But for others, those excessive ones, they were bumping their little heads and, getting bruises. So in order to help them, those of us of this size, we all agreed that we needed to move this sky. Okay, but how to do this? How to have the deer work with us? How to have folks from the other sides of the world do this? Well, we came across the need to talk, and the Creator gave us a word, Yahau. And so everybody was agreed we're going to push this sky up. And so everyone got a great big stick, and I would like you guys all to get your great big stick, okay? You can stand up. You can stand up and get your great big stick. Oh, and for those of you, please don't bruise your heads, okay? And so everyone had talked through and indicated to people, we're going to press the sky up. And so they came together and said, all right, my darlings, the first thing we're going to do is just push it. And the sky went, they pushed, Yahau, and the sky went up a little bit. And everybody, is this enough? No, Terry needs it higher. So and so again, everyone together, we're going to push the sky as a people. Ready? Yahau. And it was a little higher up. I could have my bun out of this now, okay? And so, but we are here as Skagit people, and we do things in fours. So on our third try, everybody clear yourself. Okay, ready? Yahau. Almost. One last time. And this time I want you to think about your pain. Think about your grief. Think about the things you've heard today and feel them. And this time, as you push this sky up, I want you to take the healing that comes from working together, all of us. And on this last one, Yahau. And that sky went all the way up to where it is now. So you may be seated, but the little things that remind us of this is when you look up into the sky, there were hunters. And so there's hunters and a deer. There were also some folks out in the canoe, so there's a constellation for the canoe, okay? And so always look up into the night sky and remember how we worked together, and to look at those as we lifted the sky up to where it is. So you may say, Habu, Habu.
So we'd like to offer the opportunity to ask some questions. And I've got the microphone, and I'm going to run around, and if anyone has a question, just raise your hand, and we'll get there. I can wait. Anything come to mind in Kay's stories about boarding school?
What have you done to help, or what have you been able to do to preserve your language, to help bring that to the next generation?
Well, I'm going to honor Lora here. Her grandma Vi was instrumental in documenting our language, recording it, translating it, working with a linguist, creating a dictionary. For us to be able to hear in their generations, they were first speakers. They spoke English as a second language. So what we speak, and I think even Lora as a teacher, probably is not exactly the same as our elders spoke, because we speak with English mouths first, right? So it's a bit different. And so she did a lot. I don't think we'd have language here had she not done what she did in the Northwest. I don't think there was anybody else leading in that way.
There were others, and I've got the mic on, so there were others, but what happened with many of the tribal groups is elders came together and worked with this, and some worked with linguists, and others did this grassroots, but all throughout down as far south as Nisqually and ʷalʔalq, but what happened is the elders got together. What Grandma Vi did was to help create a writing structure. So just because we are modern people and being able to read and write helps. And so what we're doing is curating classes. And I was working with an elder today where he just wanted to learn how to write some of the words that he knew. But the other thing that we're doing is going back and try to do some of this heritage work, where we're taking some of these language programs that were put together by linguists and putting them back into our traditional culture. And so one of my favorite things when I was studying the language is when you work with the old timers, they would talk English like this. You'd barely see their mouths move. And so here I am in my 20s, learning to and having to learn not to because in my regular education, I had been called a mumble mouth, and I realized, but because of the way that my mom learned English, I spoke English differently, because her mom was a native ʷalʔalq speaker, and so my mom's English was different, my English is different, and all of that speech therapy to get that stuff out of me, I'm going back and reclaiming and bringing that back, so relaxing your palate, and so that we can be more native speakers. But for us, the way to reclaim it is, well, you guys are helping reclaim it. You all speak our language, Every single one of you speak our language. Every single one of you.
They know a couple words by now.
Well, you do know
Yeah.
Yahau and
How?
yeah, and Habu, but you also know Skagit and Snohomish and Nisqually. You speak my language, our language, every time you say those words. And for us, that's the most important thing. If you know any words, that is priceless. Fluency is terrific, but I want everyone to speak ŭalʔalq, and y'all do.
It's amazing to me, speaking all over the place, how many people live in the Skagit Valley and don't know that this is about the Skagit people. This is our home. I've met people my age that had no idea.
Right.
But to answer to your question, there are tribes like ŭalʔalq and ŭalʔalq and Swinomish and ŭalʔalq that actually have language programs, and they start with the preschoolers and they work up, and so it's an active work of reclaiming language. It's very hard when, who's Lora going to speak to, right? How many people is she going to be able to speak to? That's the hardest when you're in language classes where you're going to use this. But they're doing this with the children, and they didn't inherit our resistance, our trauma resistance to learning the language. I did. It took me a long time and a lot of patience from. Laura sat with me one afternoon for like 4 hours just learning one word because I didn't realize for a long time that I was resistant, trauma resistant, because my mom didn't speak it, and it was safe. You did pass it down. It was not safe to dress like a native, to speak like a native. Whatever you could do to blend in was the safest thing to do. So these children have not grown up with that, and you can see they're learning the dances, they're learning the drum songs, they're learning the language, and they don't carry that in the same way we did.
Yeah.
It's so powerful to watch. Swinomish is amazing. But for our generation, for my brother's generation over there, it was different. We were taught to keep our head low. It wasn't safe.
Right, and I'm a baby boomer. I'm the end of our generation. And even just those few years between us, there is a difference when I got to meet Grandma Vi and start learning our language. I didn't grow up with it. I was absolutely overwhelmed with the healing that it came. That I could walk into a room and see the people there, and they're part of I could be related to any of them, and I was, and I love that, and to be able to speak it now is amazing. So.
And the first time I heard Vi speak, I was a teenager, and she's telling a story, and I was in awe of the beauty of our language. Absolutely in awe, because while my aunt that served as our grandmother spoke fluent ŭalʔalq, she didn't speak English before she went to school. Her and my uncle and her relatives and friends that lived around the valley, they would speak to each other, but not to us. So when I heard Vi telling a story, and it was so incredibly powerful and beautiful, but it's not just the story and the words and the language, which is incredible. You're hearing this, and it's like hearing music. But the other thing is Vi gets to end the story, and it's like that end. And if you've been raised in dominant culture, you know that you get all the materials, and you know all the questions that are going to be asked, and you know all the answers. But in our tradition, you're not given the answers. It's left to you to figure that out. And that could change over the course of your lifetime, depending where the story fits you then. But that's really counter to dominant teaching. You get all the materials, you study, and you get A's, right? Yes. But I looked at her in horror, like, you're not going to tell me what this means? I was a really good student. And I have come to so love and appreciate the wisdom of that teaching. So the words sound like beautiful music, and the reason that stories are told and the way they're taught is just as powerful. It empowers people in the places that they're at in that moment.
Any other questions? I have one. So what, if people wanted to learn more, what kind of resources or where would you send them to learn more about history here, personhood?
Right now, it's a bit of a renaissance. people are coming together and telling our stories. And when I was learning the language in the 80s, we had to create every single thing in order to do anything. And now I checked out YouTube again, and there is an explosion of stuff. And these are independent folks telling their stories, telling this, their individual pieces. And it's everywhere. There's in plays, there's movies, and I love that. I absolutely see how the dominant culture is affecting our kids, and they're saying, I want to express my voices, and I love it. There was a TikTok video, sorry, you can see I'm a grandma, TikTok, this newfangled TikTok. And a gentleman got out of his car in New Mexico in traffic, and he turned up his tunes and he danced right there on the freeway, or on the highway, as they were all stuck in traffic. And I'm like, that is so cool. And this guy, they were all stuck there anyway, nobody's moving. And so he gets out and dances. And what a terrific response to traffic jams. If we could all just get out and dance instead of all of the rage. And he was a gorgeous grass dancer. Oh my God, he was terrific. So it's not our kind of dancing. We love our cousins' traditions. We just know they're not ours. We're not plains, so we don't come from the big summer powwow dancing. But I still can tell, a good-looking dancer who's got moves.
I think a lot of our, after the Orange Shirt Day, coming out and finding children who had died in boarding schools and stuff, and it became certainly a national movement in Canada, and then coming down here, that a lot more of our Native people, like my mom didn't speak about boarding school till she got older. And she was so moved by what was taken from her, she went back to college in her 40s and became a political activist, and she was fierce. Mm-hmm. So, I think that has empowered people who've been in the boarding school experience, or clearly who are affected by our loved ones being there, to start sharing that voice. So I was up at Lummi this last year, and they played Bones of Crows, which was made in Canada. And I was up there with tribal people and a couple elders that went to Canadian boarding school. And after the film was over and it was done and we were sitting there, we spent 30 minutes with these elders while they wept. And the one elder that I knew well, it's never spoke ill of boarding schools. But it was like at that moment she could allow herself to feel the pain of what that meant to have everything taken from her in that boarding school. So in the same thing in Missing on Fire Trail Road, they have a couple people talking about the boarding schools, and they show a gathering of boarding school survivors. And one woman thought she was alone in her story. So I think this is allowing us to get up and speak what happened to our family, but also how it affects us now. But it is those things that are allowing that you'll hear more and more stories. You can go on YouTube and see by Hilbert and her storytelling if you just want pure joy. You can see skʷalx on YouTube. I encourage you to watch his story about how he made his first CD. I love Vi's stories. There's not many, you can't have too many of those. And then look also for the boarding school stories like Bones of Crows, The Only Good Indian. What's the other one we went and saw? Yeah, they're more recent ones. And so they tend to be in timelines of early boarding school, middle, and then the later boarding schools. And they're really quite good at reflecting that time and that family. I think they've done a really good job of sharing what that experience is, and people could understand taking your most precious possession, your children, and then taking away their relationship with you, what that costs to a community. So
thank you. If you're interested in treaties in this area, we have the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, and it is very readable. Like, if you find that online, and you'll have an idea of what our dehumanization looked like very specifically to this region, and it is shocking. So it doesn't actually take that long to read. but I would suggest checking that out just to see the history of the legal oppression and genocide and all of that of the folks in this region. So Treaty of Point Elliott, 1855, you can find it online.
And they can go to the Hay Bulb Center on Tulalip Reservation, and I'm sure there's others around here. Some of the best places are in Canada, but that would be a good place to start. It's small and has the boarding schools, and it has the treaty, and it has a lot of information to kind of jump in a smaller but direct way.
Yeah.
Question?
Free admission, first Thursday of every month. Thank you.
So just the other day, I saw a person with an indigenous drum who was in no way indigenous, it seemed to me, on the street. So can you all help us understand the difference between being supportive and encouraging and honoring indigenous traditions and cultures, and the difference between that and appropriating it? I know that's a really easy question to handle at the end of an evening.
If you question whether this is right or not, it's probably not right. That's the safest way. If you think, this is right, and I'm going to use Terry and point out, Terry, could you show them what you're wearing tonight? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Terry is wearing a beaded medallion with a bear on it. And normally you wouldn't expect this tall Norwegian man to be wearing anything that's reflective of our culture. That was a gift from my brother to him, and to be used only in prayer work. So, you'd have to, and any other time I don't think he'd wear anything representing our traditional culture of any of the many ones he's worked with. So, but what do you think? If you think it might not be right, it's probably not right.
One of the things that I got to witness when I first moved back up here in '95 is in our traditional religion, which most people don't go to. I was over in Swinomish Smokehouse, and there was a non-native person who was practicing our religion. And I was quite surprised. That's not the norm at all, and I think it's happened a handful of times in my experience. And what I loved about it is, as I learned this gentleman's story, he was a Catholic priest and had lost his family. And his boss at the time recognized that this gentleman was very close to harming himself and knew that this would help him. And I thought that was a fascinating process. And as I watched this gentleman practice our religion, there were plenty of folks that had things to say about this that were negative. But what I saw was how humble and how grateful he was in his practice. This was not anything to draw attention to him. This was him in his pain, doing what he had been helped with, and he was grateful for it. And so to me, that is truly the heart of the matter, is the heart of the person, what they are doing. And even though there were plenty of folks that said this is wrong, I looked at this gentleman.
On both sides.
Yeah.
He got permission from his supervisor. They're Jesuits. He got permission from that. And he had people that welcomed him there and were supportive, and he did lots of really good work with that. But you can imagine the division on both sides of that.
But for me, knowing that his Catholic faith as a priest was going to take him away from Smokehouse, and I worried for him, because where is he going to do this when the Catholic Church takes him away from us? He's now part of us, and I don't know what's happened to him, and it worries me, you see, because he has entered into this relationship with our traditional religion that is profound. And how is he expressing that now? wherever this man is. So I wish him well, and I pray for him, and I hope he's still well. So,
If you want to know whether something's appropriate or not, you want to know more about local tribal community, first of all, find an elder. And ask questions. It's okay to ask questions. Please ask questions. I think we'd rather have you know more than less. So find somebody that you can talk to and ask questions. We don't have, because we have not been in, the colonizers have been here less than from the East Coast, we don't have a lot of the documented books and histories that might be on some other tribes.
well, they're there, but they are shabby. But there are more things to critique in it. One of my favorites is, there's a book here called Valley of the Spirits, and it was written here in the 50s. And the author is, I've lost her at the moment, but when Grandma Vi read this story, she expected to hear this book. It was her PhD thesis, and Grandma Vi expected to see us in the pages because Grandma Vi knew who had been interviewed, who the informants were, what was said, and instead was this dry, brittle, top-down understanding of us. So things have been written, but they're not about us. They're about Western culture and its understanding of people that they just want to study and not know. And that is, to me, the shame of Valley of the Spirits. It has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with people coming together and knowing each other. My favorite story of it is in Valley of the Spirits. It says that we Upper Skagits starved every winter because we didn't know how to fish.
That goes with my mom saying that there was so much fish we could walk across them on the river. So
Well-
we were really poor fishermen then.
Well, it comes back to how the tribes were made. If you were at skʷalx when everything was being written down, you could be absolutely not from skʷalx, just be a visitor, and now be 100% skʷalx. Okay, and yeah, it just magically, and this is all over, and these two brothers raised together. One was enrolled SWIN, one was enrolled Skagit. Well, when these two informants got together with his PhD student, the downriver one said, "Oh yeah, they can't fish upriver. They're the worst. They starve every year." And she went, "Okay," and she wrote it down, and she published it in her PhD thesis. And that has actually been testified about in court. And so there are multiple court cases that talk about those Skagits who can't fish. And it's all because our Swinomish cousins were teasing each other through this researcher. Two brothers teasing each other.
These two brothers still do that
Yes,
together.
Yeah.
And on behalf of our fishermen, I'd like to tell you they are really good
They're-
fishermen.
But we actually have in court people saying, well, the Stillaguamish never left the mouth of the river. So here are some of the premier ocean-going canoe carvers for that river, and it is documented in court that they never left the mouth of their river. And it's the same kind of things. To say, so when you read the things that are out there, that are published, you're trying to get more information. Don't take it as absolute truth with a capital T, because it's not. It's another one of those forms of genocide. What is written about us has nothing to do with us as human beings or our culture or traditions. And so as you read them, if it doesn't seem like it doesn't
seems really academic. It was really hard for me to read.
Yeah.
And I read this as, there's not a lot of books published about Skagit people specifically. And the June
June
The call-
Collins, there it is. June
Yes,
Collins.
actually stayed with my grandmother when she was writing this, and she introduced her to people.
Right.
And so for me, it was a connection to my grandmother. I felt like I got to touch my grandmother. But when you read it, it is more like reading some sort of academic book back in Yale or something.
Well, it was her PhD thesis.
Yeah.
And the hard part for poor June Collins is she was in love with her thesis advisor, and he was a married man. And so she was striving to get his attention. And you can see that in her PhD thing, where she was pushing those boundaries just to get his attention. And it actually ended up being damaging for her. And she was never the same after this. And he never left his wife for her. I
So-
know it's shocking.
So just like us, you're going to have to piece it together.
Right.
The grandmothers and grandfathers came together to learn how to do ceremony. They learned how to do weaving. They came back and put all their puzzle pieces together. So if you want to learn more about us, you're going to have to be part of the puzzle making pieces as well.
Right. And use your hutch. That's what we call it. So thank you guys for coming today. So, thank you.
Thank you so, so much. And one other resource, if you want to be in the presence of a healing piece of art, the Valley of Our Spirits story pole in downtown Mount Vernon on the Riverwalk was designed by Jay Bowen, Kay's brother. And it's an amazing piece just to sit with and to be with. So I encourage you for that too. So thank you again, Kay and Lora. And we are so grateful for your gift of being teachers for us and friends to us. It's a priceless gift, priceless. Thank you. And we will see you back next week to hear stories of descendants of the new people. Thank you very much.